Check, check, 1 2 1 2. Check, check, 1 2 1 2. Check.
Just getting settled. The speaker is a little thing.
Janet, I want to get I want to thank everybody for coming. My name's Bill Lyons. I'm with the Baker Center, Director of Am I not working? Can you hear me now? I think you can. Nothing like reverberating voice, right? I'm Bill Lyons. I'm the Director of Policy Partnerships with the Howard Baker Institute for Public Policy. I want to welcome you to the first of our series on public square, where we're going to engage in issues a lot closer to home than many of the global issues that we've been privileged to work with at the Baker Center. Our executive director, Marianne Wanamaker, is here as well, along with Mayor Kincannon, and we're very excited to hear from Thomas Apt tonight, but I'm going to have Mayor Kincannon make the introduction to Thomas, and I'm going to briefly, and it'll be brief, not what you deserve, but a brief introduction of Mayor Kincannon. Many of you may not know this, but Mayor Kincannon not only has a BA in history from Haverford College, but is also a master's degree in public affairs and urban and regional planning from Princeton. She was chair of the school board, very active in the community, came to work at the city when I was there. We overlapped quite a bit, and then has been mayor and is doing a fantastic job. We got to know each other sort of in the intersection of the politics and the policy space. You need them both. Good policy without getting anything enacted doesn't do much good. When we both were in a meeting and saw a not very impressive, won't name any names, but presentation, and came out, and I said, I don't know about that, and India was shaking her head, and I said, this person needs to read, and we almost both said at the same time, Edward Tufte, The Visual Display of Graphical Data, which I had used when I was a professor, and she was familiar with. And I thought there was a little bit of a meeting of the minds there. That's right. So I'm going to let Mayor Kincannon introduce our speaker, Thomas Apt.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyons. I appreciate the warm introduction. And I just also want to say, as we address how to save lives by stopping violence today, it's wonderful to see so many people here. I want to first give a shout out to Councilwoman Janet Testerman. I really appreciate you being here, because our city council is a leader in this work and funding it and making it happen. Of course, I'm thrilled to see our friends from Justice Knox here who've been helping to advocate on that. UT, you guys been great supporters of this endeavor, and I'm thrilled that we're starting this series, because so many people here care about this university, and the university cares about Knoxville and the people of this city. So I'm very grateful for that. Shout out to all the city folks here, UT students. Thank you for being here. We're grateful that you're here and that you care about the city that you're living in. And after you graduate, please stay. Please stay and come work for the city and other places. So also very glad to see some of our KPD leadership team here, including our new chief, Paul Noel. So he's going to be up there talking to everybody, and we'll get to introduce him a little bit more later. So anyhow, I appreciate everyone being here. This is a serious problem in our city. We have, since I became mayor, we've faced an unprecedented number of homicides in our city, and it's been the most challenging thing that we have faced as a city and that I have faced as mayor. And we've been working really hard to make strides in that regard. So just a few things that we have done to date. Just last night, City Council voted to award $200,000 in grants to help organizations serving opportunity youth. We are working with community partners, and LaKenya Middlebrook in particular is working to help start up a street violence interruption team, and that's a work in progress. We formed the Office of Community Safety, and I appointed Director Middlebrook to lead that effort. And we just announced our new police chief, Paul Noel, who embraces these principles and is going to bring them to the Knoxville Police Department. So as we dealt with this, and even before we had the most acute surge in violence in our city, we came across Thomas Apt's book, Bleeding Out, The Devastating Consequence of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. And I read this book, and I found it incredibly compelling, and also, from my perspective, incredibly pragmatic. It was sort of like a guidebook for mayors to how to stop violence in our city, based on evidence and practices that are community informed and that have been proven to work. And we all have good intentions, but we also want to put our energy towards things that actually help stop the violence. So this book was inspiring to me, and I'm so grateful that Thomas Apt has come here. I think I just emailed you, and I was like, well, who knows if this, Harvard professor and author will respond, and he did right away and continues to respond to me and members of my team, and has made himself very accessible, and here he is today in the flesh, in a very timely manner to help us move forward in this work. So I want to share a little more background about Mr. Apt. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice, where he chairs the Violent Crime Working Group. He previously served as senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he has also held leadership positions in the New York Governor's Office and in the Office of Justice Programs at the United States Department of Justice. Mr. Apt has a wealth of knowledge and is committed to supporting cities in reducing violence and saving lives. I know this because of his willingness to talk with and advise me and mayors all across the country. And I've so appreciated his insight and look forward to sharing those insights more broadly with the community today. So now, on behalf of my administration and everyone here tonight, we're looking forward to being part of the discussion. And again, thank you for your expertise. And please, everyone, join me in welcoming Mr. Thomas Apt.
It's not every day you get that kind of introduction by that kind of leader. I am just incredibly gratified that, to Mayor Kincannon, that you and your team have read this book and been, hopefully inspired by it to do the incredibly important but also very difficult work of violence reduction. And I do correspond and engage with lots of mayors, but Mayor Kincannon, your enthusiasm and your passion is really resonates with me. So thank you. So what I'd like to do is try to go through relatively briefly. I'm going to try to move pretty quickly because we do have some great co-panelists on this that I think we'd be best served by a real conversation. I'm going to sort of do a general talk about what I think needs to happen in this space, and it's going to be informed first by the book that you heard about that was published in 2019, but then some recent work that I've done at the council, particularly some work that was done just in January of this year. But I'd like to begin with a bit of a metaphor. So I'd like everyone to sort of imagine yourselves to be a surgeon working the midnight shift in the emergency room in a hospital in Knoxville. It's like Friday night, about 2 a.m., and a young man is wheeled in on a gurney, and he's been shot. And the young man is losing blood quickly because he's been shot in the leg, in the femoral artery, which is the largest blood vessel in the body. And the question to you, the treating surgeon on duty at the time, is what do you do? Or maybe more particularly, what do you do first? So you look at the young man and you see that from his clothes, from other signs, he seems to have led a life of deprivation. So maybe the first thing you need to do is to find this young man a job, or maybe you need to find him an apartment, or maybe you need to help him get his degree. On the other hand, this young man has been involved in some sort of violent conflict, and he might be dangerous. So he's unconscious right now, but maybe while he's unconscious, you should place him in restraints, or call hospital security, or even call 911. But I would submit that none of us in that room would do either of those things, or any of those things. Instead, we would do the only morally common sense, obvious thing that to do at the time, which is we would stop the bleeding. Because if we didn't stop the bleeding, this young man would die. And that's really the whole premise of Bleeding Out. That's the very first sort of opening series in the book. And the idea is that we need to treat gun violence as a nation the way we treat it in the ER, like a gunshot wound, and with that same sense of intense urgency. And in fact, we need to treat it like we would through the 4 stages that you typically see in most emergency rooms. triage, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. And that's roughly the way I organize the book, and that's the way I'll organize this conversation. So let's begin with triage, which is the practice of putting first things first. Let's talk about community gun violence. Homicides have spiked 29% from 2019 to 2020 across the country. That is the single largest year-to-year increase since the recording, since these crime statistics were recorded. We saw another 5% increase last year, and this year, nationally, there seems to be a slight increase, maybe less than 5% nationally. Homicides have reached historic highs in more than a dozen cities, and this current spike is being driven by community gun violence, meaning gun violence that's happening in public cities driven by firearms. Now, since 9/11, we've lost hundreds of lives tragically due to terrorist attacks and mass shootings, but thousands upon thousands more have lost their lives due to the everyday tragedy and ongoing tragedy of gun violence. It's important to understand the profound trauma of community gun violence. It impacts all aspects of urban development. It's enormously costly, more than $10 million per homicide. And when you add that up, you're talking about direct medical costs, you're talking about the cost of the criminal justice system, but you're also talking about all the indirect costs of the fear and avoidance of violent crime. And that shows up in property costs, that shows up in raised insurance premiums, it shows up in increased taxes, and it shows up in diminished commercial and economic investment. The other thing that we know is that we don't all suffer from this issue equally. In fact, it's deeply unequal. Black men make up less than 5% of the U.S. population, but more than 51% of gun homicide victims. We don't talk about it a lot, but the number one victim of violent crime in this country are black men. And maybe most profoundly and most tragically, the biggest impact that we see on violence may be on poor kids. We see that potentially chronic exposure to violence may be the central mechanism by which poor kids are kept poor, meaning their income mobility is limited. How does that happen? It happens because when you're exposed repeatedly to violence, that exposure occupies your brain. You're thinking about it both consciously and unconsciously, and it occupies space in your brain that you would be otherwise using for other things. And I think we're going to hear more about this from our panelists. And so what you'll see actually is children who are exposed to violence will have an immediate diminishment in academic performance immediately after exposure to a violent event. But the chronic exposure is going to affect their educational outcomes over their lifetime. And unfortunately, that disparity in educational outcomes is then going to affect their ability to get the kind of job that could actually help them escape poverty. So gun violence is literally trapping poor kids in poverty, and we need to do something about it. So that's trauma. That's the trauma stage, the reason why we need to address this. I often say that community gun violence isn't the only thing you need to do to address urban poverty. It may not be even the most important thing that you need to do, but it is the first thing you need to do, simply in terms of sequence. Because if people are not safe, none of the other things that we take for granted matter. People can't advance in the ways that we hope to. It is the bottom rung on Maslow's hierarchy. So now I want to talk about diagnosis. You can't treat a problem or treat an injury if you don't understand it. And so the first thing to know about community gun violence is that it is highly concentrated. And in fact, it's concentrated both demographically and geographically. In every city, Knoxville included, a small number of people, a fraction of a percent of the city's population, are going to account for the overwhelming majority of gun violence in that jurisdiction. The same is true in terms of geography. A small number of blocks are going to account for the vast majority of incidents. And so there's a relatively common sense notion that if gun violence is highly concentrated, then the interventions, either prevention-oriented interventions or enforcement-oriented interventions, the ones that target those concentrations, they're going to be the most effective ones. And that's what we see. We see it in policing. We see it in gang prevention. We see it in reentry. We also see it not just in the criminal justice sphere, but we also see it in public health, where tertiary prevention typically outperforms secondary and primary prevention. And I just want to say something about the sites that you're seeing here. All of these citations are not to individual studies, but they're to systematic reviews. And what that means is these are rigorous syntheses of multiple studies. So when I'm talking about these points, I'm not talking about one researcher finding one finding in one context. I'm talking often about dozens of findings all piled on top of one another so that you can have real confidence in these conclusions. Now, you might think that if violence is highly concentrated and then you target that concentration, maybe you'll just have the balloon effect. You squeeze on the balloon here and then it expands over here. Fortunately, we know that while displacement might be a concern, it doesn't happen significantly. And that's because there is something sticky about these, what we sometimes call hot people and hot places. It takes a lifetime of trauma to create a person who is potentially willing to pull the trigger. And it takes decades of disinvestment to create a hotspot microlocation. And I want to point out something that's very important about this finding. Because violence concentrates not among general classes of people and not across whole neighborhoods, but instead in small networks of people and within microlocations within the neighborhood, it's a really big mistake to stigmatize entire groups of people or entire neighborhoods with the broad brush of poverty. Even in the most allegedly dangerous areas, most people are not dangerous. And that's a very important thing to understand as we move forward. Now, the other thing that we learned and that we know is that community gun violence responds to both rewards and punishments. And I have to say, my colleague Chris Winship and I from Harvard, I think that we were a bit surprised by this finding. I think we were expecting to see more effectiveness on the sort of enforcement side, maybe less effectiveness on the prevention side. That's not what we saw. We saw a lot of tough on crime interventions that were effective. We saw a lot of soft on crime approaches that were effective. Also, tough on crime approaches that were ineffective, same thing with soft on crime. There was not a bias one way or another. And in fact, I think that really reflects the real world situation that we see in cities across America. There's no city in the United States that I'm aware of that has successfully simply arrested their way out of violence or simply programmed their way out of violence. And that makes sense because you need prevention to divert future offenders, but you need enforcement to deter, incapacitate current offenders. There has to be some carrot and there has to be some stick. And that's a difficult conversation to have today in our hyper-polarized political environment, where some people seem to end up all the way on one side or all the way on the other. The other thing we know is that community gun violence thrives on injustice. What we know is that gun violence is closely connected to legitimacy. And essentially that means that less fairness leads to more violence. And we see that in the aftermath of Ferguson and in the aftermath of Minneapolis. And we know this happens because there are pronounced spikes in homicides, not just in those cities, but nationally when these highly publicized incidents happen. But we don't exactly know why. But we have two bodies of research that suggest the way. The first is procedural justice, and we have a number of studies in this area that show that a lack of trust and confidence means that people are less likely to comply with law enforcement orders, and they're more likely to turn to violence. Similarly, a separate body of research called legal cynicism shows that when people don't believe in the system, they don't use it. And with criminal justice, that's particularly important because they don't use the system for its most traditional, most fundamental purpose, which is the nonviolent resolution of disputes. And so what we have to understand is that we need to get away from this either-or framing and adopt a both-and framing. Of course, we need to have justice reforms that increase confidence in our criminal justice system. Reforms in policing, prosecution, courts, and of course corrections. But we need to be able to do that at the same time as we cooperate to drive violence down. We need to be able to have this both and conversation. So based on these three findings, that violence is concentrated, that it responds to both punishment and rewards, and that fairness is necessary. These are the three central anti-violence components. If you want to be successful in this area, you must be focused, you must be balanced, and you must be fair. Because if it's concentrated, then you're going to need these focused strategies, because if it responds to rewards and punishments, you need balance. And of course, because if gun violence thrives in the presence of injustice, you're going to need fairness. So that's diagnosis. So let's proceed to treatment. Rather than thinking about this problem as a complex socioeconomic phenomenon that has been around for decades and has a million different causes and correlates, let's try to break it down into something that is more understandable and more actionable. People, places, and behaviors. The violence concentrates around small groups of people, small groups of places, and small groups of behaviors. So let's talk about the people-based approaches. How do you engage these highest risk people, the people who are most likely to shoot or be shot? If you look at the hundreds of evaluations in this area, the most successful interventions generally follow this five-step process in some way. Not exactly, of course, but this is roughly what they do. First, they identify those who are at the highest risk, and then they engage them. They start building rapport, because remember that the people who are at the highest risk for gun violence are some of the most deeply marginalized, deeply disconnected people. They are highly suspicious of the government and of authority. So the first time you ask them to participate, they're going to say no, probably in much more colorful language than that. Second, third time, you need to develop rapport with them, often using people that they already know and respect. And that's a crucial role for street outreach workers. So you need to engage them and build rapport. Once you've engaged them, then you need to stabilize them. Really, when we talk about people being at risk, they're really in crisis. They don't have a steady place to stay. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. They may be subject to arrest at any moment. And finally, and most importantly, someone is out there trying to kill them. They have serious enemies. So you have to meet those immediate needs if you want to get them to change their life. You have to get them into a more stable housing situation, a more stable, stability in a number of ways. But most important is safety planning. Most important is, look, we're going to arrange a safe surrender so you can deal with all of those fines and fees that are, subjecting you to warrants and things like that. And we're going to work with you to talk about which neighborhoods you're safe in, which you're not, how you can get around and navigate those areas, and we'll work with you behind the scenes to hopefully mediate some of these conflicts. Once they're stabilized, you need to treat that unhealthy thinking, unsafe behavior, and trauma that got them into this in the first place. Folks who are at risk in this have literally really been through hell and back. They have higher rates of PTSD than returning veterans from the Iraq than veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict. And that PTSD makes them hypervigilant, meaning very quick to anger, very quick to see threats, sometimes where they exist, sometimes where they don't. You have to treat that hypervigilance before you can do anything else. And the most effective way to do that is through cognitive behavioral therapy or some type of intervention that uses cognitive behavioral therapy. Once treated, then you can do what most people think is the beginning of the process. Then you can start offering opportunities, education, employment, and other things like that. But you have to recognize that even under the best of circumstances, even this process, which is very rich and very evidence-informed, may not work. And you have to be ready, willing, and able to punish those who persist in violence. You have to be willing to remove them from the community. With place-based approaches, there's a similar balance. It's not just about policing, although policing is absolutely important. It's also about placemaking and community building. It's about investing in these micro locations, changing their physical makeup so that they are less crime prone. And then drawing people together, not across the entire city, but in these micro locations so they can partner and problem solve together with law enforcement and others to make their communities, their micro communities, safer. And with behavior-based approaches, one of the things that we know, unfortunately, from the research is that many of the broadest efforts to reduce guns, gangs, and drugs are not particularly effective in reducing community gun violence. And the reason is because they're not focused. They're not focused on that highest risk. That doesn't mean that those things are not important and worth doing in their own right. It's just saying that they're not a substitute for the policies and strategies that I'm talking about here. And so what I'd like to argue for is, in terms of community gun violence, you need to reframe this. And instead of thinking of guns generally, think about gun carrying by hot people in hot places. Don't think about gangs generally. Think about gang banging by hot people in hot places. Don't think about drugs. Think about violent drug conflicts between hot people in hot places. And all of a sudden, this very complicated, very confusing thing starts becoming a little more solvable, a little more actionable, because you're breaking it down into pieces. One of the most successful interventions, this is right on the right, you see this is a chart that's showing all the different studies. You don't need to really understand this. I just want you to know that this isn't one study. This is, it's 24 tests in total, with 19 of 24 showing crime-worthy violence reduction effects. And for the ones that specifically targeted gang and group violence, 12 out of 12 were effective. You don't need to know what a 0.657 effect size means. All you need to know is that it's very significant, meaning that it can translate into gun violence reductions of 40%, 50%, 60%. And a good example is Oakland ceasefire. I'm not going to put up all of the strategies that are effective in reducing gun violence, and I'm not suggesting that this is the only one or that every city needs to do this strategy. But one of the reasons that this is effective, and I'm putting it up here, is because it is focused. It focuses only on the highest risk individuals and groups. It's balanced. It involves police, community members, and service providers coming together and saying, we want to help you, but if you won't let us help you and you persist in gun violence, then we're here to stop you. And then finally, it's perceived to be fair, not just by communities, but also by the individuals who are the focus of the intervention itself, because it speaks to them directly and offers them a choice. And so what I want to suggest is that whatever you do in this space, whether it's focused deterrence, whether it's another combination of programs, it has to be focused, balanced, and fair. So we've discussed triage, diagnosis, prognosis, and now treatment, and now let's get to prognosis. So how do you put all this together? To succeed, you need to put these principles of focus and balance and fairness into place. You need to coordinate people and place-based and behavior-based strategies. You need both prevention and enforcement. And so the question is can cities really do this? This is just too complicated. And the answer is no, it's not too complicated if you proceed one step at a time. And so now I want to transition to some of the work that I've done at the council with the council's Violent Crime Working Group. The working group started in July. We got to work very quickly. We had a diverse range of leaders. For those of you who know the field, this is really sort of a who's who in the violence reduction field of leaders across law enforcement, public health, advocacy, and other areas. We got to work quickly, producing reports, holding events, and importantly, issuing 7 bulletins highlighting key findings. I highly urge you to Google this working group and review its findings. But I just want to talk about the 10 actions. The 10 actions was an effort to identify the 10 most important things, not the only things to do, that every city should do to make the greatest immediate impact. And it's somewhat aspirational in nature. Not every city no city is doing all 10 of these well. But the goal is to get cities as close as possible. Now, these are short-term measures that can be started within a year, and they're not substitute for the larger-term things that would address root causes. And here they are. I want to conclude and make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. But I want to just point out the first three: setting a clear goal, identifying the key people and places driving the violence, and then creating a plan around that to engage those people and places. So the key takeaways here: violence can be reduced. There is a roadmap for doing it. It's not a mathematical formula. It'll look different here in Knoxville than it looks in other places, but there are some general rules of the road. Bleeding Out describes a lot of this. For those of you who haven't read it, I probably haven't been in many audiences where as many people actually have read it. And the 10 actions are backed by evidence, and they're politically supported by a diverse set of stakeholders, and it's written in actionable language. The 10 actions list is actually no more than 4 pages long in total. So take a look at that. And again, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Yes, go over there. And I'll ask our other panelists to take the table. And LaKenya, if you wouldn't mind coming up. We're going to now move to a moderated panel discussion. And I want to briefly introduce the participants here. Our moderator is going to be LaKenya Middlebrook, who is the Director of Community Safety at the City of Knoxville. LaKenya is an attorney. She was in practicing law. She has a law degree from the University of Tennessee. And she went from that, and I will say that had to have its challenges, to one of the most challenging jobs I've ever seen, and that's the Police Advisory Review Commission for the City of Knoxville. It involves a lot of mediating between citizens who are concerned about the actions of police and police answering the questions and responding to those concerns, and also having some tough questions asked about events that have occurred. And I would say LaKenya did a fantastic job there. LaKenya will be moderating. We also have Patricia Bumwini, who's from the College of Social Work. Unfortunately, she's a terrific professor, very highly published, does a terrific job, and very adept at dealing with the questions that come up in this environment. Patricia's going to be leaving us. I think this is her last day before, now not leaving the university, right? Correct. Moving over to Nashville, being part of the Nashville office of the College of Social Work. So thank you for being here. As you leave, we have our new police chief, Paul Noel, coming. So there's a little bit of convergence of forces here. And Paul comes from the city of New Orleans with a fantastic record, and we're also enthusiastic about his taking over and coming into this position. So thank you very much. And of course, you've heard from Thomas. And I'm going to now turn it over to LaKenya to moderate a panel discussion, and then we'll also segue into a question and answer session and try to promise to get you out of here at the appropriate time. So, LaKenya?
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Lyons. Good evening. Thank you all again. I want to reiterate Dr. Lyons and Mayor Kincannon's sentiments that it is fantastic to see everyone here tonight, and we are especially grateful for Mr. Apt coming to dedicate so much time and energy and insight to us here at the city. I'm going to shift this over this way. I have on my big girl shoes, so I feel like I'm hovering, so I'll just kind of sit here if that's okay. And I have a few prepared questions that hopefully we'll get some conversation going with the panel, but we do absolutely want to leave some time because I'm sure that there are so many of you all out here who may have some questions, and so we will try to make sure that we leave some time for some questions from the audience. And I will start with Mr. Apt, who probably wishes that I would give him a few minutes to catch his breath after sharing so much information with us, and just kind of asked, you've had some time to spend about a day and a half here with us here in Knoxville, and talked with Mayor Kincannon and city staff, and have been in regular communication with her for quite some time. And I would be interested to hear your perspective on how you see some of these strategies that you have discussed being able to be applied here in Knoxville, and kind of how you view the landscape of violence reduction work here in Knoxville.
Sure. I have to say I've sort of I'm pretty exhausted right now, but don't let that exhaustion confuse you. I'm enthusiastic about what I'm seeing here. I think that, look, Knoxville has a lot of challenges, but they're not unique challenges. It's very important to remember that violence has risen significantly in almost every city around the country. And so Knoxville is not unique in that effect. And a lot of the factors that caused gun violence to rise are national. And many of the weaknesses that I see in Knoxville are weaknesses that are common to almost all of the cities. Not enough coherent planning, not enough concrete partnerships around specific things, and the quite technical and sophisticated application of some of these programs. This is not as sort of this is most places in the country. But what I do see is a tremendous amount of commitment from a very broad array of stakeholders, from the mayor to the incoming police chief to many, many community and faith-based leaders, who are all willing to do two things. One of which is they're willing to learn, and they're willing to compromise, and really to do what I think is the most important thing here in Knoxville, but frankly all across the country, which is do a lot less of trying to win arguments and a lot more of trying to solve problems. And so I have to say I think I am pretty optimistic about the future of Knoxville in this aspect. I want to stress much of the work is ahead of the city. And a lot of it will be very difficult work, but I'm optimistic.
Excellent, thank you. Professor Bamwini, and congratulations, we will miss you. As Mr. Apt talked about in his presentation and talked so extensively about in the book, these approaches really require coordination and focus across multiple sectors, right? And so a lot of times, as he mentioned, when we think about conversations around reducing violence, it really focuses in on the law enforcement aspect. But we know that there's a role for social services, for community-centered responses. As we think about that, how are you thinking about the role that these folks can play in addressing violence, and really especially how we approach it from the focus that Mr. Apt talks about, and really focusing in on those highest risk individuals instead of kind of painting with a broad brush?
Yeah. My apologies. I'm a little bit shorter for this, but I actually want to acknowledge my positionality before I answer that question. As a macro social worker, so someone who's thinking about policy and organizations and communities, more so than an individual, and also as an implementation scientist, it's easy for me to lose sight of the people that we are actually talking about. Mm-hmm. So forgive me, but before I go into my head space, I would like to take us back to our heart space. And so to answer your question, I want to elevate a voice that is not on this panel right now. And so the first time that I heard this poem, I was at a middle school called Woodland Hills. And it says, "I am confused and afraid. I wonder what path I will take. I hear that there are only two ways out. I see my mothers bury their sons, and I want my mom to never feel that pain. I am confused and afraid. I pretend all is fine. I feel like I'm suffocating. I touch nothing, so I believe all is fine. I worry that it isn't, though. I cry no more because I'm confused and afraid. I understand people believe that I'm just a statistic. I say to them, I'm different. I dream of a life getting easier. I try my best to make my dream come true." Written by Antoine Rose on the 16th of May, 2016, in his English class as his teacher was trying to help the students cope with the death of a classmate. I heard these words read by those classmates with the support of their English teacher at his funeral. Now, I want to note that this was a police-involved shooting. he was writing about a non-police involved shooting. And so I want to take my position very clear that I am not an abstract, black and white thinker. I'm very much in the space of thinking about all of this work and the way that we can all work together. But I think it's important as we talk about these topics to remember who we are talking about and remembering that they are not in this room. And so I want to keep that voice at the center rather than mine, and that position at the center as I answer this question. Know that that's who my heart and my head is focused on. Not so much the research that I do, but the kids who are impacted by this work. And so I think that, yes, multi-level interventions is incredibly important. As stated, there are multiple factors involved. I'll say the way that I got to know this work first was as an AmeriCorps member who was working with a suspected shooter and another suspected shooter's sister who was jumped as a warning sign by the other side of the argument and the conflict. And so I've worked with both people that would be classified as a perp, and I've worked with young people that would be classified as a survivor. My intervention point of choice is homicide bereavement, specifically because after choosing to recognize my privilege as a second-generation PhD student, who because of upward mobility of my parents, I was moved out of a neighborhood like that. I wanted to know what it was like to have that exposure, to do this work as someone who has heard the gunshots at night, to do this work as someone who had to get off the bus and hope that I made it home. And so after 10 years of living in that community, after 10 years of living in a community where young people were buried on the daily, I come to you not just as an implementation scientist, but as someone who took the time to recognize my privilege and put myself in their shoes. And so today I say, yes, we all need to be involved. Social workers need to be sitting at the table with police officers. Police officers need to be sitting at the table with the ICU nurse, the ICU physician. I think all these conversations need to happen, but I think the most important piece is that the biggest stakeholder are the people who have that exposure. And so my greatest recommendation is that we not just have these conversations, but that we actually live in unity with these issues, that we don't just talk about these topics outside of where it's actually happening. And once you integrate yourself into these neighborhoods and into these families, and you create a grandma on the block who can tell you what's really going on, you'll actually be able to see all these moving pieces that sometimes we're missing in the science. And so being able to elevate those voices, I think, is the key part to any of this work. While yes, it's evidence-based, we're not working very well as a team because we've forgotten the greatest voice. And that's the people who actually are impacted by this work. And so I'm a huge supporter of the science. I'm an implementation science. It's actually how I pay my bills. And so I'm not against it. But I think the biggest piece that is missing is who are the stakeholders themselves? Are they experts like me, or is it grandma that had to bury her child? My mentor also always says we measure our success by how many bodies were underground this year. And so every year, that's how I measure my success. How many funerals did I have to attend? How many funeral directors had to prepare a young person for their parents? How many preachers are eulogizing young people? And so my encouragement is that while we look at the science, we don't forget to look at the people and to hear them. And so that might not be the answer you were looking for, because I think the science is clear and clear cut. But I think where the science is lacking is that it's our voices. And so my recommendation is that we do better of being in community and in unity and actually living with the people who encounter these exposures every day.
Absolutely, and I think that brings up a very necessary point, and I will kind of open the discussion to whoever wants to. I'm looking at you, Thomas, but because one of the things that you talk quite a bit about is just that, the need to balance the systems level stakeholders, the evidence-informed approaches with the expertise and the experiences of those who have been impacted, and thinking about how we approach bringing more of those voices into the space and elevating those voices, and making sure, and thank you again for sharing that poem and centering us in that space. But Thomas, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, the value and the necessity of making sure that those who are most directly impacted are a part of the conversation, and that those folks are viewed, not just the scientists, but that those folks are viewed as experts into what is happening in their communities and how to approach these issues.
Yeah, I think it's first of all, I'm grateful for your comments about centering those voices, and I think that if you do this work, you have to keep those voices in mind, and you have to stay in communication with them. Some of this work, in some ways, was for me motivated by a woman named Kim Odom, who lives in Roxbury, which is about 20 minutes away from me, who spoke to a national conference on violence reduction that I was organizing on behalf of President Obama. And that happened in 2009, and her words sort of stayed with me, and I sort of got in contact with her and stayed in contact with her. And ultimately, she was profiled in my book, and and her talk about the loss of her son Stephen, who was murdered several years ago, and her and her husband Ron, their activism and their deep sense of loss. And I think that this work has to involve a balance of the heart and the mind. And I think that you need both. And I think that having researchers like us at the table is absolutely important, but they have to be in conversation with people with direct experience. I also think the same is true of all of these things. I think that, and that's one of the things that's sort of interesting about this work. Some of it is a science, but some of it is an art. There's a coldness to it and a warmth to it. And the interplay between those two is really important. And if you forget about one or the other, I think you can go astray. But those types of poems are, for me at least, hard to hear. I've come across many of them. Reading Stephen's essay that was written a year before he was murdered about gun violence in Boston and how he was praying for the city, was just pretty brutal. And to sit with Kim and talk about those things. But I think it's extremely important, and so I think it centers us. So thank you.
We'll shift gears just a little bit, Chief Noel, and get you in here. And thank you again for being here. We realize that you don't work for us yet.
I thought you were going to give me a pass.
Sorry. And I'll and I apologize because this is kind of going to, I want to make sure that we give at least time for one or two questions. So this will kind of be a loaded question and kind of compress a couple of things into one question. But so much of the discussion around how to do this work effectively relies on focus and making sure that we are focused in on the right people, places, and behaviors. And so thinking about and considering all that law enforcement is asked and expected to address and to do, how do departments really begin the process of implementing the focused strategies that are discussed? And I know you can probably pull in some examples from your previous experience to talk about that.
Sure. So before I answer the question, when you read that poem, it reminded me of a mother from New Orleans that participated in some of our gang call-ins that lost 4 sons to gun violence, all of her sons. And she would come to the call-ins, kind of like you referenced in a book, and plead to the people we were trying to change their lives and say, think about the mothers. Think of what you're doing to the mothers. And it always stuck with me. And that really jumped in my head when you read that poem. And it just, grounds you on how important this work is. But when you're talking about focus, and, Thomas App really references this in his book, we don't do a very good job of sticking to this and really focusing. But what we have to look at, the mission of the organization, what we're trying to accomplish. And, what we did in New Orleans, I think we did a decent job of implementing this with initial success. But what happened once we had the lowest number of murders in New Orleans since the 1960s, and think about that. New Orleans is a historically very violent city. We achieved the lowest numbers of murders, doing a very unorganized version of this. But what happened is we start doing so well then, It said, let's start doing other things. And we walked away from the core principles of what got us there. And then we start trying to be everything to everyone. And what we found in a city like New Orleans, which is a city of about 400,000 people, about 300 square miles, is there were only really 3 or 4 really small locations where an overwhelming majority of our violence was occurring in. And one of those areas we call the Central City Square is about one square mile in the Uptown Garden District area of New Orleans. And we went from having a murder or shooting occurring almost every day to going like almost a month without having a murder or shooting in that area, which was beyond successful. But then what happened is we walked away and we declared victory and we said, you know, we're done, we're going to do something else. And then now you look at the violence in New Orleans, it's returned to, you know, potentially the highest number of murders this year in a very long time. And, you know, we went from doing really well to not doing really well. So the focus part is important. So I think it's important for myself, the leaders of the police department, which are in this room today, to always remember that the micro locations that Thomas App talks about, even when we reduce violent crime in those micro locations, and we absolutely will, we have to stick with it, and we have to continue with those intervention measures, whether they're walking beats, engaging the community. We can't walk back. Now, we can do other things, but we also always have to stay grounded and hold those areas to keep this from reversing.
Excellent, thank you. I have more questions that I could ask, but I want to make sure that we have time for any audience questions that we may have. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand, and we have a student with, or a staff member with microphone that can. I wish I was a student. You look like a student.
Anybody?
You have a question in the corner?
Hello, my name is Elijah Winningham, and I'm a student at the University of Tennessee, majoring in political science, hoping to become a lawyer one day. And often when we look around Knoxville, we see, it's not hidden that there's not a lot of diversity here. And we were talking about how a majority of the people that are affected are minorities. Mr. Professor Abbott. And so when we look at that, I was wondering if you had anything to say about how maybe the race of an officer affects the trust of the community. And then I would also like to ask future Chief Noel how you plan on gaining back the trust of the community in the police, so that when they do call or when they see a police car, they don't have fear, but they have confidence that they are more safe than more in danger.
Great questions. And to the question, to me, when I look at the literature, first of all, racial disparities are endemic to the criminal justice system. They start with the beginning of the process and arrests, and they go all the way through the process with incarceration. But it's also important to understand that we see racial disparities throughout most of our systems, our health systems, our education systems, our housing systems. We are not as equal or as fair a society in total as we would like to be. And I think the criminal justice system is no exception, and we have work to do. But the interesting thing about the racial disparities that I see, and I think some of the studies of actual racial animus and disparate treatment, is that some of the biggest disparities are not based on the race of the perpetrator. They're based on the race of the victim. And one of the disturbing disparities that you see is that white victims of violence are a lot more likely to get justice than black victims of violence. And in marginalized communities, they understand that if more privileged, more affluent communities suffered from this same problem, it would have been solved a long time ago. And so I think one of the things that we have to do through our leadership and through our in government and in community and faith-based leaders is really insist that every life is important and that we value those lives and understand that we are tied to one another. And so the citizens of Knoxville should all feel impacted by the fact that some citizens are hugely at risk for gun violence while others are not. Some citizens in this country, and that we should feel a sort of collective sense of outrage, and that we should be able to approach that with both a sense of empathy and accountability. So we have empathy for those who are caught up in this cycle of violence, both as perpetrators and victims. But we also understand that there's going to be accountability. But there's a lot of sciencey ways to talk about it, but a lot of it is just like do the right thing and treat folks equally.
Thank you for your question. So it's no secret that we need to do a better job of recruiting more minorities and more females to the Knoxville Police Department. When I was announced just a few days ago, it was one of the first things I talked about. So how do we get there? So if we're going to ask people of color to join the police department, it's imperative that we do everything we can to build trust and legitimacy within those communities. So that's going to start with me as the chief. And you have some of the command staff here from this organization in this room. And we're going to be out in the community building those relationships. And those relationships really need to be built one person at a time, starting with me, but down the line through every member of the organization. When I talked to the officers for the first time the other day, I haven't even started yet. I'll start to June 13th. But we talked about that community interactions are not just going to a community event. They're not coming to this event and talking to people. They're not going coffee with a cop or going to a neighborhood meeting. That's just where we meet the people. That's just where it starts. Community engagement is collaborating and working with members of our community to solve problems and to create safe public spaces. And the other thing I told them is, the importance of violent crime reduction, but the methods that we use to reduce violence are equally as important as getting that violence reduction ourselves. So it's important that we reduce crime, but we do so by treating the members of the community with dignity and respect and building trust and legitimacy within our communities. And I believe when we do that, not only will you see violent crime reduce in Knoxville, but that trust and legitimacy is going to grow, and that will help us recruit more people of color from our community and boost the ranks of the Knoxville Police Department, which we absolutely have to do.
Thank you. We have time for one more question if anybody else has a question. The Baker Center has been gracious to. We have a question back here.
My name is William Dorr, and I'm on a similar track to Elijah. I'm from Savannah, Georgia, which is demographically very, very different than Knoxville. It's a majority black city, and it has a very, very large socioeconomic disparity because there are very high-income jobs, and then there are not very many middle-class jobs and many, many low-class jobs. So the question that I had for you all, from my personal perspective over the last time being in Knoxville, I see a very distorted perspective of the overall problems from an academic perspective, looking into an area that they are not personally from, as opposed to individuals who are in an area. So my question would it not be more effective for a private entity comprised of individuals from a certain community that are more involved and actually have experience, like Ms. Bamwan pointed out? Would it not be more effective for them through grant funding to implement your rules as opposed to a governmental agency?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. But I think that I'm going to gently disagree with you in that I think you're subtly adopting this sort of either-or framing. And one of the things I cannot emphasize enough is that violence reduction is a team sport. And so, of course, the community needs to be involved. And the mayor has announced many different levels of grants that are going to community organizations. But the community, it is profoundly unfair to, if you're familiar with the history of how we got here, to marginalize communities over many, many, many generations. This happens in many cities, not just Knoxville. And then, at the end of this very difficult, very brutal process that ultimately produces a lot of social dysfunction, go, hey, community, you figure it out. We have an obligation to help fix this problem that people in power, people in influence created. And there are just simply assets that community members don't have. They have rich experiences and insights, but evidence and research and those methods can help those things. And so I constantly want to emphasize that this is a partnership. You don't want, and that's why I talk about community-informed initiatives. It's not community-based and not evidence-based initiatives. It's evidence-informed initiatives. I don't think that we need that collaboration in order to be most successful.
Can I clarify there? I didn't mean that it was one or the other. I completely understand that. I was talking about it being coupled with private funding for a group that was within the community you are active in.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not quite sure I understand. Let's talk about that after, because it sounds very interesting, but I'm not sure I quite understand what you're suggesting. But thank you.
Did you want to jump in on
Yeah,
that?
I have to say my practice was in Pittsburgh, but my research is primarily in St. Louis. From a practice perspective, it was an integration of multiple models. And so we had individuals that were bringing in OGs, and OGs beat the block. We have a green light, red light system with the school. There are hospital-based interventions. And so it was very much that integrated model where, and I also want to note one thing that is different about Knoxville is its ability to recruit and retain people that have the expertise that also come from those backgrounds. And so part of it is that you do have people from those communities that are very successful, but they don't come back. And so part of what Pittsburgh has done has been able to think through who is their talent that they've lost. And those individuals come back and serve. And so for my organization, the bulk of the kids that I worked with are now adults. They're parents. They're in their mid-20s. They're in their mid to late 20s. And so yes, that's where they started, but they now have the training to be able to go back and serve. And I think that's a key component of what Knoxville is lacking, is that it hasn't been able to close the gap in some of those ways. So you have these neighborhoods with kids who have these traumatic histories and are now raising children in the neighborhood where they grew up, but they got that Coca-Cola scholarship to go to Duke and come back as a teacher. They're now trying to become a PhD. And so they're both the expert and the member of the community. And so I think that is one thing that Knoxville is lacking, is that there are too many people like me that might look like the community, but they're not from here. And so I don't know what it's like to go through what someone in Knoxville goes through. I know what it's like to be Black in Knoxville. I know what it's like to be thinking about would I want to raise my children in Knoxville, but I'm not actually a member of the community in the same way. So I think that's one issue when you're thinking about compartmentalizing, is that in some of these cities, there's a brain drain of that talent. And your young Black talent are going to DC, they're going to New York, they're going to Atlanta, and they're not coming back. So you do have those experts coming out of Austin East, but are they coming back to Austin East? And why aren't they coming back? Because their quality of life is better in Atlanta, period. You got to have a reason to keep people here. And so I think compartmentalizing who is in the community as just the kid who's exposed to it, or the adult who never moved, is a little problematic. The other thing I'll say with St. Louis, the team that I work with there, we work hand in hand with the chief of police and the chief of the school district. And we're designing an annual personal safety survey that would go out every single year across the county to be able to assess where in the county do people feel safe and with who, and how are they actually interacting with police, so that we have an actual measurable account that can demonstrate, okay, you're only coming into contact with a police officer when you're up to no good. Right? How do we change that? Are you coming into contact with police officers in the street? Are you coming in contact with them at school? And so really being able to have a real data set that shows us year to year to year, what does safety mean to the community? But that's not just for the community, it's for the police officers too. So when I said earlier that I'm not a black and white thinker, I understand that a police officer has to protect themselves too. They deserve to go home. So how does everyone feel safe in this town? And also I think I would challenge Knoxville to start calling Knoxville and Knox County the community instead of always talking about East Knoxville. Because as a transplant, that broke my heart. That's the neighborhood over there. No, you're all Knoxville. You're all Knox County. So the whole community can be engaged if they choose to be so.
Thank you. And I think that that's a very important point, and thank you for sharing that. And, as kind of was mentioned earlier, the idea that these are issues that impact our entire community, and that it's important for us to talk about them as such. And I'm so grateful to see so many people from communities who are not directly impacted, who are invested and engaged in this issue. I'm talking fast because we're well past our time, and I want to make sure that Mary Ann gets the chance to share. And so I want to thank our panelists for sharing, and each of you all for coming. And I will say, And I will close by saying that I am very proud to be one of the people who is from this community and who grew up in this community and who is a proud graduate of Austin East High School and can attest to the fact that she's saying that great talent comes from there and that there are people who are willing to invest and stay. And we do have to do a better job of making sure that more of us are investing and staying in this community. So thank you all again. Thank you, Mr. Apt, for coming and giving so much time. And Mary Ann will close us out.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I'm Mary Ann Wanamaker, Executive Director here at the Baker Center. And we at the Baker Center feel like there's magic when faculty and government and students and community and borrowed experts from other places come together. And so I think you have well proven that tonight. So thank you for being here. Have a safe trip home. Stay connected to us. And then let's just one more time give a round of applause to our panelists.